In 1944, a bomber pilot over Europe had roughly a 1 in 4 chance of finishing his tour without being shot down. Crews learned that number before they ever saw Germany. It sat behind every joke in the mess and every quiet moment on the hard stand. The system's answer was always the same: tighter formations, stricter discipline, more faith in the combat box. In the last half minute before bombs away, when flak thickened and the target came into view, individual judgment was supposed to end. The lead ship followed the line on the map, everyone else held position, and survival was treated as a calculation of altitude, heading, and predicted fire. There was little room in that logic for what pilots actually saw: winds that pushed entire streams off track, batteries that had moved, other American bomb groups arriving seconds early or seconds late. On one mission, 18 liberators reached that final 30 seconds and found the safe corridor they had been promised simply was not there. What followed began with a single defiant movement of metal against the sky and ended with 18 bombers back on English grass instead of scattered across a rail yard in burning pieces. Before dawn, in a cold briefing hut hundreds of kilometers away, the route had seemed simple enough. Intelligence officers had traced the jagged line from the English fields to the target rail junction, marked the initial point where the bomb run would begin, and emphasized discipline. Radio silence would protect the column from direction-finding stations, tight spacing would concentrate defensive fire, and every crew was ordered to treat the designated course and turn points as fixed. The men had watched the pointer move across the wall map and listened to the familiar words about acceptable risk and predicted flak. Now, with the ground speed higher than planned and the wind sliding entire formation sideways, those assumptions are being shredded in front of the lead pilot's eyes. His instruments still show the agreed altitude and heading. The bomb run is seconds away. Standard doctrine says that on final approach, he must not jink, must not weave, must certainly not rock his wings. Any sudden movement will ripple backward, forcing heavy, fully loaded bombers into overcorrections, stalls, or collisions. Yet in the view through his armored glass, the straight line toward the target is no longer a path. It is an impact point. The lead bomber is about to drag 17 other aircraft and more than 150 men into a volume of sky that is already lethal. It is in those few heartbeats, with tracers beginning to stitch the air at their flight level and the silhouette of the upper group creeping into dangerous overlap, that the pilot reaches for an option that does not exist in any manual. Instead of holding rock-steady wings, he moves the yoke just enough to make the huge Liberator answer, lets one wing dip, brings it back, then repeats the motion in a deliberate, exaggerated signal and commits to a new course. For the crews behind him, it is a visual shock that demands an instant decision, and their response will determine whether this trap closes or simply becomes another entry in a logbook that records 18 aircraft out in 18 aircraft home. A decade before that mission, air planners in London, Washington, and Rome believed they had solved the problem of keeping heavy bombers alive. The answer, repeated in training manuals and classroom films, was the combat box: dozens of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators stacked in altitude and offset in position so that their 50 caliber machine guns overlapped into a continuous defensive sphere. On diagrams, each tightening ring of guns looked like armor. If every pilot held his assigned place, the theory promised that enemy fighters would be shredded before they could break into the formation, and that a concentrated pattern of bombs would fall onto the target with mathematical precision. In lecture halls, instructors pointed to those drawings as proof that discipline and geometry could substitute for escort fighters that might not arrive on time. The reality over Germany and occupied Europe was harsher. A combat box 30 or 40 aircraft wide took long minutes to maneuver, especially when every bomber carried a full load of fuel and ordnance. The tighter the spacing, the more sensitive the entire structure became to turbulence, prop wash, and the smallest heading change by the lead. Radio silence, enforced to prevent German listening stations from plotting the streams, meant that only a handful of prearranged flares and visual cues were allowed once the bomb run began. Crews were trained to watch the lead's bomb bay doors, to align on his track, and to ignore their own instincts when flak blossomed off the planned course. By 1943, lost statistics were already signaling the limits of the theory. Some 8th Air Force groups recorded single-day losses above 10% of dispatched aircraft, even before the rendezvous with long-range escorts became routine. And many of those losses came not from fighters, but from massed anti-aircraft fire that found the predictable altitudes and headings of the streams. Crews described missions in which the air seemed full of other American bombers on slightly different schedules, each trusting the same paper corridors through the sky. When weather shifted winds aloft or delayed one group by minutes, carefully separated tracks converged into overlapping boxes of metal and explosives. Yet the institutional response was rarely to question the basic concept. Investigations into heavy losses tended to highlight crews that drifted from position or leaders who had not held the briefed headings long enough. The prescription was almost always the same: more training, tighter formations, stricter adherence to pre-printed routes and turns. Even as diagrams of the air war grew more crowded, the RUR system demanded that individuals fit the picture rather than adjust the picture to fit what they actually saw above the target. By the time the unnamed lead pilot of those 18 liberators climbed into his aircraft for the mission that would define his career, the abstract language of acceptable losses had become something concrete and personal. It meant the empty bunk across the hut, the coffee cup left on a table after a man failed to return, the crew list crossed out on a board in the operations room. He had arrived in theater as one more first lieutenant trained on the B-24, an aircraft famed for its range and payload, but also for its heavy controls and knife-like Davis wing that punished clumsy handling in tight formation. His early sorties taught him to fight that airframe into its assigned slot and then to keep it there, no matter how the slipstream and turbulence tried to pry it loose. On paper, his job was simple: match the lead's indicated airspeed, maintain the correct interval, and ignore the fear that came whenever black bursts of flak bracketed the formation. In practice, each mission added to a private catalog of near misses in patterns that did not appear in the official summaries. He watched as an entire box drifted a fraction of a degree off course and into the edge of a known flak belt, as a minor change in wind direction turned a comfortable separation between two bomber groups into a dangerously thin vertical gap. He saw a wingman overcorrect to stay in place and wallow into disturbed air so violent that the bomber's wings flexed and its engines briefly bit at empty sky. None of these moments appeared in the formal debriefs as causative factors. When aircraft failed to return, investigators traced lines back to enemy gun positions, to fighter attacks, or to weather, and then filed them under headings that implied inevitability. The lead pilot began keeping his own notes in a small, oil-stained notebook. Estimated winds, real ground speeds, his position relative to other formations when flak concentrations appeared somewhere other than predicted. The more he flew, the clearer it became that the last half minute before bombs away was both the most scripted and the least forgiving slice of any mission. What troubled him most was not the presence of danger, but the rigidity of the system's response to it. As long as radios stayed silent and doctrine insisted that visible steadiness equaled competence, there seemed to be no sanctioned way for a leader to signal an emergency course change without dissolving the fragile order that kept dozens of bombers from colliding. He understood why manuals warned against sudden movements. He also understood that continuing straight ahead simply because the map said so could herd an entire squadron into a kill zone. That unresolved tension would ride with him into the cockpit on the morning when weather, timing, and enemy fire combined to remove the last margins, or error. If you're enjoying this documentary, please like the video and share it with fellow World War II enthusiasts. Hit subscribe as well. Your support really matters and keeps this channel moving forward. The mission order that morning did not advertise itself as exceptional. The primary target was a rail junction feeding German armor, a familiar objective in the campaign to strangle the Reich's mobility. In the briefing hut, crews sat while intelligence officers traced the route from their English base across the channel, over occupied territory, to an initial point that would line them up on the yards. The exit leg was drawn as a smooth arc away from the heaviest batteries, The timings calculated so that stacked groups would pass through their assigned boxes of air without overlap. Weather officers added their charts, noting forecast winds aloft and a band of broken cloud near the target area, but nothing in their tone suggested catastrophe. To men who had already flown through overcast and ice, a prediction of scattered cloud and moderate tailwinds sounded almost benign. The crews filed past reconnaissance photographs of the junction, memorizing flak positions and reference features. They were reminded that radio silence would be in force, that deviation from the printed headings required authorization, and that last-minute improvisation on the bomb run was considered more dangerous than enemy fire. The lead pilot listened like everyone else, absorbing the planner's confidence that the sky could be managed by lines on paper. Once airborne, the mission began, much like dozens before it. The 18-ship squadron formed its combat box and then slotted into the larger stream. As the column climbed through layers of cloud into the cold air above, the tailwind made itself felt. Ground speed crept higher than briefed, compressing the gaps between formations. Somewhere above and ahead, another group adjusted its schedule to account for the same invisible push, but there was no practical way for crews in one box to know how the others were coping. Crossing the last navigation point before the target, the lead pilot noted that his squadron was arriving early relative to the plan. At the same time, gunners began to pick out glints of sunlight off other aircraft at different altitudes, converging toward the same cluster of rail lines. The broken cloud that had seemed minor in the briefing now complicated everything, revealing and hiding shapes in a way that made spacing difficult to judge. When the upper lead group rolled into its prescribed turn at the initial point, batteries on the ground opened fire, as if they had been waiting for that movement. Within moments, the air ahead of the 18 bombers filled with the bursts of heavy shells set to explode at their altitude. The pre-planned exit arc, so clean on the wall map, now ran through a concentration of fire that had shifted from its charted position and directly beneath another formation, beginning its own drop. On the instruments, nothing had yet broken. In the actual sky, the corridor the squadron was supposed to occupy was rapidly becoming the worst possible place to be. In the controlled environment of a training base, instructors were blunt about what professionalism looked like on a bomb run. A steady attitude and unwavering wings signaled competence. Any sudden rolling motion signaled fear or loss of control. Stories mocked leaders who waved their formations into confusion, and those lessons seeped into the instincts of every pilot in the 18-ship squadron. They understood that on the final approach, surrounded by other aircraft and loaded with explosives, the safest thing a leader could do was hold the line drawn for him on the map. Now above the rail junction, that line led straight into converging dangers. Heavy batteries on the ground had zeroed in on the altitude of the upper group and were adjusting their fuses to catch anything following in the same band of sky. Delayed timing meant that bombs from those higher bombers would soon be falling through the exact volume into which the lower squadron was supposed to turn. The lead pilot of the 18 B-24s could see the geometry coming together. His assigned exit path would thread his men between concentrated fire and descending ordnance with almost no margin. For a few seconds, he tried to make the plan work. Minor throttle changes and the smallest drift away from the densest flak patterns bought him almost nothing. The instruments insisted that he was where he should be. Visual reality insisted he was about to lead more than 150 men into a lethal intersection. With radio silent and no cleared verbal call for a new heading, the system left him with two choices: stay on course and hope the overlap somehow resolved itself, or create a new signal in defiance of the written rules. He chose the second path. Instead of making a gradual, easily misread change, he moved the control column enough to make the bomber's long wings tilt clearly against the horizon, then brought it back to level, then repeated the motion in a way no experienced wingman could mistake for turbulence. Only then did he feed in the turn that would carry the squadron away from the charted exit arc and toward a secondary route that the navigation team had identified earlier as a contingency. Behind the lead, each pilot had to interpret what he was seeing. Some hesitated, torn between doctrine and the obvious warning being flown in front of them. Others reacted almost at once, rolling their own bomb-laden aircraft onto the new heading. Gunners watched the space they had just vacated erupt in bursts of flak. Turbulence and sudden changes in bank angle jolted the formation, but no aircraft collided, and none were left alone in the old corridor. When the turn settled and the new line of flight stabilized, the squadron was shaken but still intact. The wing dip that had seemed unprofessional in lectures had in practice become a simple, unmistakable order to survive. On the operations board, the mission did not stand out at first glance. 18 aircraft dispatched, 18 returned, no bombers missing, no crews listed as killed or wounded. In a campaign where some days saw dozens of aircraft fail to come back from a single division, a zero-loss sortie could easily be chalked up as a welcome but unremarkable success. Logbooks recorded fuel loads, time off target, and remarks about moderate to heavy flak. Only when navigators and intelligence officers began to reconstruct the precise tracks flown did the unusual pattern behind those ordinary numbers emerge. In the squadron debriefing rooms, crews marked their positions on large maps with grease pencils. Navigators compared their estimated winds and course corrections with the routes plotted for other groups in the bomber stream. Reconnaissance photographs taken after the raid showed not only bomb impacts on the rail junction, but also dense clusters of anti-aircraft bursts along the originally briefed exit arc. Analysts overlaid those images with timing reports from formations that had followed the plan exactly. The picture that formed was stark. Had the 18-ship squadron held to its assigned turn, it would have flown directly through a flak concentration hardened by experience and calibration, and into the descending bombs of a higher group delayed by weather. This was not guesswork based on impressions from the air. The reconstructed tracks showed altitude, headings, and spacing to within known margins of error. For the officers piecing together these accounts, the conclusion was simple. The unauthorized maneuver had taken an entire squadron out of a three-dimensional kill zone defined by enemy guns and friendly ordnance. The absence of wrecks on the map was not luck. It was the direct consequence of a single decision. Reactions to that fact were far from uniform. Some operations officers saw danger in elevating any individual initiative on the bomb run to a positive example. They worried that highlighting this mission would encourage other leaders to improvise under stress, fracturing formations, and introducing new collision risks. Others, especially those who had watched carefully planned routes fail when weather or enemy adaptation shifted the variables, argued that the rigid interpretation of doctrine was itself becoming hazardous. In higher headquarters, the mission was added to a quiet discussion about whether visual, aircraft-based signals could offer a controlled way for formation leaders to communicate emergency changes without breaking radio silence. The squadron's report did not rewrite the manuals overnight. It did, however, provide a case in which strict application of existing rules would almost certainly have produced multiple losses, while a single clearly flown deviation had preserved every aircraft. As those findings circulated through staff channels, they began to erode the assumption that discipline always meant doing exactly what the pre-mission diagrams demanded, even when the sky no longer resembled the clean lines on the wall. Long before any formal directive mentioned the sortie by date or squadron number, the story of the wing dip began to travel by word of mouth. Aircrew culture in the heavy bomber forces carried its own oral history. Tales of improbable escapes, disastrous errors, and rare moments when an individual decision had obviously changed an outcome. Around mess tables and in crowded huts, men described the day a lead pilot on the bomb run had apparently lost his mind, rolled his aircraft in a way that would have earned a reprimand in training, and yet somehow brought every bomber home. The details shifted in retelling, but two facts remained constant. The maneuver had violated the spirit of the manuals, and the mission had ended without a single loss. Instructors and tactics officers could not officially endorse improvisation, yet many of them listened carefully when such stories circulated. They knew from their own experience that formations were becoming denser, routes more crowded, and that small timing errors now had larger consequences as the scale of the air offensive grew. Standard visual cues already existed to manage ordinary changes: small, steady turns by the lead, flare colors to signal bomb release, or grouping instructions, minor power adjustments to open or close intervals. What the system lacked was a clearly recognized, nonverbal way for a leader to declare that the situation had moved beyond routine corrections into an emergency that required an immediate, coordinated deviation. Gradually, without headline announcements, conversations in some training units began to acknowledge that the aircraft itself could serve as that signal. If a lead bomber executed a pronounced wing rock or a deliberate, clearly sustained bank away from a known threat, and then held a new heading, that motion could be treated as an instruction rather than a mistake. Post-war formation flying manuals would eventually formalize a whole vocabulary of such gestures. Wing dips to initiate cross-unders, wing rocks to attract attention, and distinct rolls to signal rejoin or spacing changes, all designed so that wingmen could respond without a single word on the radio. For veterans who had flown B-17s and B-24s over Europe, these codified signals felt less like innovations and more like the disciplined descendants of what desperate leaders had already done when flak and congested skies left no time for discussion. They recognized in the neat diagrams of peacetime training the same basic principle that had guided that seemingly ridiculous maneuver. In a formation built on mutual trust, the most visible aircraft could communicate intent through motion when electronics and regulations fell short. The mission that saved 18 bombers did not become a famous case study, and the pilot's name did not enter the popular record. But the logic of his action seeped into doctrine until it was hard to imagine formation flying without it. In the decades after the war, the airfields from which the heavy bombers had risen changed character or disappeared altogether. Some were returned to farmland, their runways broken up and plowed under. Others became civilian airports where commercial aircraft followed gentler schedules and carried unarmed passengers instead of bombs. The men who had flown B-24s across occupied Europe scattered into new lives. A few stayed in uniform. Many joined emerging airlines. Others set aviation aside entirely. For most of them, memories of individual missions blurred together, distinguished only by the rare days of extraordinary loss or obvious disaster. The sortia in which 18 bombers followed an unauthorized wing dip and returned intact left no dramatic wreckage on the countryside and no headline in the press. It produced no gallantry citation because the system was not organized to reward the avoidance of catastrophe it had never officially predicted. On paper, it was one successful raid among thousands carried out by Allied air forces. Yet its quiet influence could be traced in places that official statistics rarely captured. Every time a later formation leader in another conflict or training exercise used a decisive movement of his aircraft to warn his unit away from unexpected fire or congestion, he was drawing on a language first improvised under those flak bursts. As technology advanced, radios became more reliable, navigation more precise, and radar and data links reduced the need for large, rigid formations. Still, visual signals never disappeared from pilot training. Manuals continued to list standardized wing rocks and wing dips, and instructors emphasized that in close company, where delays and misunderstandings on the radio could be dangerous, the simple sight of a leader's aircraft-changing attitude remained one of the fastest ways to transmit intent. Airshow teams, transport squadrons, and warbird organizations all adopted their own variations on this vocabulary, often without realizing how deeply it was rooted in wartime necessity. The legacy of the mission that saved 18 bombers was not a monument or a museum exhibit, but a pattern of survival repeated countless times. It lived in unremarkable log entries where formations diverted smoothly around storm cells or weapons tests, and in the unspoken confidence that if the leader moved in a clear, deliberate way, there was a good reason to follow. The crews on that original rail junction raid could not know how many later pilots and passengers would benefit from a habit forged in their brief moment of crisis. What their story suggests is that in systems built on procedure and planning, lasting change often arrives not through formal orders, but through a single, visible act of judgment that others quietly adopt until it becomes the new, safer normal. If you've made it this far, you're one of us, searching for the truth behind the headlines and the courage behind the silence. Subscribe to the channel And let's keep exploring the hidden wars, secret operations, and untold fates that shape the world we live in.